Our discussion of the scientific study of self-delusion is probably best led off with the concept of preconceived notions. So let's begin with a brief story about the 31st time Dartmouth College and Princeton University faced off in football. That game helped launch an endless fleet of expeditions into the human mind, many of which you will read about after this paragraph concludes. Both founded in the mid-1700s, Dartmouth and Princeton are part of the Ivy League of schools in the northeastern United States. You've heard of the other 6 schools: Brown, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, Penn, and Yale. For most people in the country, Ivy League has become synonymous with the sort of people who wear fancy pants. The names are among the most desired bullet points on a resume. But Ivy League began as a term sports writers used for the 8 schools in New England that tended to compete against one another exclusively in athletics and, well, most everything else. In 1951, Dartmouth and Princeton squared off in the last game of the season for both schools. Princeton had won every game up to that point. Its star player, Dick Kazmaier, had been featured on the cover of Time that same year, and would go on to become the last Ivy League player to receive the Heisman Trophy. It was a big game for both teams, which is why Princeton went bonkers in the second quarter after a Dartmouth player broke Kazmaier's nose. In the next quarter, a Princeton player snapped a Dartmouth player's leg. The whole event was brutal, and both sides racked up plenty of penalties before Princeton finally won by a final score of 13-0. Psychologist Albert Hastorf at Dartmouth and Hadley Cantrill at Princeton noticed soon after the game the college newspapers of each school began printing stories that seemed to suggest 2 versions of the truth were in open competition to become the official version of reality. A year later, the 2 published a study that is now considered by many to be the best starting point for talking about self-delusion. Hastorf and Cantrill noticed that Princeton's newspaper and alumni newsletter published accounts of the game that painted the Dartmouth team as bullies who played dirty. At the same time, Dartmouth's newspaper published editorials explaining away the injuries caused by its team while also noting the awfulness of Princeton's tactics. Both sides, the researchers said, remembered seeing different games. What if these students could watch the game again, thought the scientists. Sure, they remembered the game differently, but what if we showed them a film of it? Would they see the game differently in real time as well? To answer this, the scientists acquired a recording of the entire matchup, showed it to undergraduates from both schools, and had those students check when they saw infractions, in addition to marking how severe each infraction seemed. The students also filled out questionnaires. The results? During the film, Princeton students believed they were watching a violent, uncivilized game, and Dartmouth was to blame. 90% wrote they felt Dartmouth had started the unsportsmanlike conduct. They also reported seeing twice as many infractions coming from Dartmouth than they saw coming from Princeton, and they found those infractions committed by their own school's team to be much milder than those committed by their school's opponents. Dartmouth students, however, saw something else. They didn't see the game as unnecessarily barbarous, but as justifiably rough and fair. The majority of Dartmouth subjects reported both teams were to blame for the aggressive play, and Princeton students were just angry because their superstar had gotten hurt. Boo-hoo. They recorded an equal number of infractions by both teams, but overall marked down half as many for their own side than did the Princeton students. The scientists explained that each person saw a different game, despite the fact that all had watched the same film. Each person experienced a different version of reality, of the truth, each in some way adulterated by his allegiance. The great lesson of Princeton versus Dartmouth concerns how tiny and arbitrary variations can change everything. The students who watched the film, regardless of whether they had attended the real event, experienced 2 different versions of reality, even though on paper they all seemed like nearly identical people.